I'm thrilled. Thank you, Grace. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here today. I joined Zendesk just about a year ago to build out this program around accelerator and VC partnerships for the startup program here at Zendesk. And as Grace mentioned, I've been a founder a couple times prior to this. I've also done CRM implementations at over 6 companies over the years, spanning from SaaS to marketplaces and consumer electronics. And so many of the lessons I learned while building those businesses are why I came to Zendesk. So I'm happy to be here to share some of that with you. First, I'd like to start with just talking a little bit about Zendesk products. We essentially have 2 categories of products. Our first is our sales CRM. Think of that as a way to manage your outbound communications with customers. And then, of course, Zendesk is really well known for our customer service software. It's used by a lot of the most well-known unicorns that have popped up over the last decade or so. We've grown up with them. We've been able to serve them as startups, and we're still serving them today as enterprise customers. And what's great about the software is that it works regardless of the size of or scale of your business. And as you think about it, it's a really great tool for handling a lot of incoming communication. So that's how I would think about the 2 different products we offer. And of course, I'd be remiss not to mention the free software offer we do have for companies coming in, startups that qualify through Startup Grind. You all have access to 6 months of our tools at no cost. In addition to that, we offer a number of benefits tailored to startups, including onboarding support, access to community resources and events. And so you can apply using the link provided by Startup Grind. So with that, I do want to get into the topic for today, which is mostly going to be educational. So this is really coming off of some of the experiences that I've had. When you first start when you're starting your first company, I think one of the most critical but often overlooked roles you take on is that of chief salesperson. For many founders, it's uncharted territory. It was for me when I did it for the first time. And it's not something you can outsource because it applies to everything you need to do as a founder. So you're not going to hire somebody to do this stuff for you. As a founder, you're going to be responsible for this as you're building your business. And what I mean by chief salesperson is that you're not just selling a product to customers, which is a big part of the job, but you're also recruiting promising candidates to your team, and you're pitching potential investors. Those are all different sales processes. And if the thought of that makes you the least bit uncomfortable, don't worry about it. You're not alone. But what's great about sales is that it's an acquired skill. I love to think about Bill Gates. Bill Gates is an incredible salesperson. I imagine when he was dropping out of Harvard, he might not have been. But if you look at like him today, his presentation, the way he talks, it's something he's perfected over the years. And you know, I know there's a lot of advice out there on how to perfect your pitch. But really the focus on this discussion is more tactical. It's going to be, how do you leverage technology to put an effective sales process in place? So today we'll get into the basics of a CRM, then talk about building a lead qualification process. After that, I'll probably pause for some questions, and then we'll go into how you structure your sales process around your sales pipeline, and then share some examples of some different sales processes. And then finally, what I'll do is I'll wrap up with some pro tips, some lessons I've learned, kind of doing things the hard way. And we'll get into that and hopefully have some time for plenty of questions. So let's start with some basics of a CRM and how it's structured. Beautiful thing about a good sales CRM is that it provides a complete structure for your sales process. With a few exceptions, most CRMs will follow the same basic set of rules. There's a common vernacular that you'll get to know that might be foreign if you're new to sales, but these basic rules also apply to the way a recruiting or fundraising process might work as well. So as you're thinking about that, keep that in mind as you're building out different parts of your startup. So typical CRMs are relational databases that contain objects that are linked together. So like, for example, a contact object here you see is linked to an account object. Within each object, you're going to have profile data, an activity log, and communications relating to that object. So with a good CRM, you know, one thing to look out for is like, where are you going to go? What object do you go to see all the communications you're having with a customer? That's something to keep in mind. And hopefully that's all logged in a place where it's easy to see, and it's automatically connected to your email and your phone systems, and everything just kind of shows up in a seamless way. The 4 primary objects as you're building out your CRM, and this is what you'll find in most CRMs, is leads, contacts, accounts, and deals. Deals can also be known as opportunities or potential. If you compare that to the sales process you may be currently running in a spreadsheet, you probably are only using one object, right? The tab, and then each column represents profile data, activity log, communications, all in one place. So that can get a little bit challenging as you're scaling your CRM. And in a CRM though, a lead is first qualified, and then it is converted into account, contact, and potential deal. There are some variations on this. So from different CRMs, you might see done differently. Different sales, depending on your needs, you might be able to customize it in different ways. The heart of the CRM is going to be tracking the potential deals or opportunities. Some CRMs also refer to this as potentials. Deals are typically child objects to accounts and can usually have multiple contacts associated with them. So when you're thinking about it, there's a company is obviously in many cases going to have different people that you might talk to in a sales process. Depending on the business that you have, you may find that multiple deals with multiple contacts might be associated under an account. So it can get pretty complex pretty quickly, and understanding who's the primary on each deal is going to be an important part of it. And who, what deal on the account is being worked on by who. That kind of stuff can come through in a good CRM structure. Some examples why you might have multiple deals would be is if you're selling multiple products into the same organization, or if you have a SaaS product with renewals or upgrades. But oftentimes, if you're just working with one sale, a one-time sale for a customer, let's say if you're selling a single product to a single customer, then you might see something that's a bit more simplified where you might see for every customer, you might have a deal in place there. In that case, what you're looking at is a situation where the customer, you may not even need an account. You might use a residence instead in that example. So these are some of the examples of how the CRMs are structured at a high level. Next, I want to get into qualifying leads. So at first glance, and this is a lesson that I learned, when I first got started, the lead object seems redundant. Don't really understand the purpose, but as you start to implement your process and build your entire marketing and sales funnel, you'll start to figure out the way to work with both leads and accounts and contacts. So first, leads are going to help you evaluate whether or not your marketing efforts are producing qualified leads. So that's kind of the most important reason to have it separated out, because you're really, with leads, you're just focusing on how are you getting leads, where they're coming from, and how are you qualifying them. To track this, again, the most important aspects of the lead object are going to be the lead source and the lead status. Lead source tells you, obviously where it came from, and lead status is going to tell you whether or not it's qualified or if somebody's working on it. And then as your team scales, this lead object is going to help keep your sales team focused on qualified leads that have been converted into accounts, contacts, and opportunities, whereas your leads will be where your marketing team is focusing on. So they're trying to generate the leads and qualifying them for the sales team. So it helps to kind of separate that out so each team can focus on what they're needing to do. And it's really important to start thinking about this very early on, because it's also going to set the basis for your reporting, especially around your marketing efficacy. As you think about you're growing your business, you want to make sure that the leads you're generating are good leads. So you definitely want to be able to score that effort based on whether or not the lead is qualified, not based on whether or not it converts into a sale. Because as you think about the separation of responsibilities, your marketing team's job should be to get qualified leads to your sales team. And then your sales team should be the ones jumping in to take on the actual sale. And that way you're evaluating your sales team based on that. And you've been able to evaluate your marketing team based on their ability to get the qualified leads over to sales. So the goal of the lead object is going to be to determine whether or not that lead is qualified, right? So a great example I like to use is if you have a pool cleaning business and your marketing efforts drum up a lead from someone who doesn't own a pool, then that's generally an unqualified lead, right? So if the lead is indeed a homeowner, potential customer, then the lead is qualified and can be converted. Knowing this is important because if you spend $1,000 to generate 100 leads and get no sales, it's going to help to know if the leads are all homeowners that you couldn't sell, or if none of them were homeowners, in which case your salesperson never had a chance and you need to find a better source for leads. So as you think about that, that's what we're trying to accomplish here with the lead object. In this slide, what I've put together is a sample lead qualification process. This is essentially a default process. It's pretty simple, straightforward, right? You get the new leads. You want to know what hasn't been touched yet. So those stay new. In some CRMs, you might call it open. You can always rename these steps, but this is pretty standard to have them, untouched. Once they've been touched, you move them into working, contacted, whatever you want to call it. I like to use the term working, and that just means that someone owns the lead, they're reaching out, they're trying to qualify it, right? And then the last two steps are whether or not they've been qualified, or if for some reason they're unqualified and don't meet the requirements to be a potential customer. One of the mistakes I made when I was first doing this the first time around is I was thinking like qualified meant that yeah, we're going to sell them, and unqualified means that they said no, right? And that's not what unqualified means. Unqualified means that they aren't a potential customer. Whether or not they want to be a customer is up to sales to figure out. But what marketing here and what the lead is trying to tell you is this a potential customer or not? Because when you're building out a marketing org, that's the only thing that you want them focused on, is generating potential customers. And then your sales org, again, is going to focus on selling those customers. So don't make the mistake I made when you're looking at your leads. Qualified means that they are a potential customer, and then kick it over to sales. Unqualified means that they don't meet those requirements to be a potential customer. So with that, I want to pause for any questions at this point. Is anyone raising their hand? And can I answer any questions?
I want to go back to talking about the marketing and sales collaboration. We had an event last week that was about like the importance of marketing and sales teams being cohesive and collaborative, given how much their work is incorporated with each other. And you were saying that like, if the marketing efforts are working, then the leads are coming in. If they're not, then the leads aren't coming in. Can you talk about your team or at Zendesk, how the marketing and sales teams collaborate to make sure that each people's goals are working in tandem with one another?
Yeah, there are certain, as you think about your overall broader organizational funnel, right? And less about what's going on in the CRM, but just your overall organizational funnel. Everyone should care about the handoffs at each step of the funnel, right? So in your pipeline from one stage to the next, but we think about it more holistically. So as you think about what happens when you're getting a lead that's coming in that marketing's sending in, having everybody aligned on the fact that, well, we want to make sure that lead gets followed up by sales, right? So that's an area where everybody's aligned, and just being absolutely clear, I think, is really important on who's responsible for what, right? And so in some cases, you might say, well, marketing's really responsible for taking that extra step to make sure that sales actually engages with the lead. In other cases, you might say that, well, all marketing needs to do is present the lead, and then sales is going to take it off. I think what's really important in this, when you're structuring this with your team, and it's just a good general philosophy, but you always want to know who's on first and what's on second, right? Like you need to have clear delineation of responsibilities, and as long as you have that, then what you're going to see is that that handoff is going to become more smooth, because you know who owns it, and marketing knows where its responsibilities end, and sales knows where its responsibilities start. But everybody should be aligned in wanting to make sure that handoff is happening, and that's just one area. You can take that and think about that at every other juncture in the customer journey, right? From if there's a trial, for example, there's the starting the trial, and then there's the handoff after the trial. What happens then? And then once they've completed the trial, and then there's a sales process. You might have handoffs during the sales process, as well as an onboarding process after that. So I think that's something that matters at every stage. And then just being able to track it and knowing is also very important. I think that we've been able to get a lot of alignment on our team, particularly around this, because we're now, implementing more and more data that we're tracking that allows us to identify things. An important thing is knowing the time it takes to go through certain stages, or the time between when someone contacts you and when you follow up. That stuff really matters. We use a velocity metric for that. And when you start to see the velocity metric and you see how you can change that velocity metric and how that's going to affect conversion, those are the things that I think really help to get the team aligned. Like, hey, this really matters when you can see we have access to that data.
Yeah, great. And Mohammed would love to hear more about acting as you own SDR as a founder, parentheses lead gen. How would you go about doing this for SaaS B2B with ACV of 5 to 25,000? And what point does a prospect go from lead to account? I think that's probably a few questions in one. So
it's a very specific question. Yeah. I mean, look, I think I like to keep it very clean. I don't. It was part of the question that you're going to do the SDR work yourself. So you're doing some of the qualification yourself as the founder. Yeah. You want to think like your organization is a lot bigger than it is, right? So even though you may be doing everything, you still want to get in the habit of starting to establish this process early on. And the reason why it matters is, even if you're doing the SDR work, you're doing the sales work, maybe you're even doing the marketing at the front end yourself as a founder, it matters to establish this early, to know this, because when you start to build a team around it, having this infrastructure in place is going to help keep the team focused. And so having them focused on leads, if they're just doing qualification, I think it's just important to do and start thinking about early on. If I were, my approach, and I tend to be very hands-on with this stuff, which is why I now work at Zendesk and talk to founders about this all the time, because when I was doing this as a founder, I got really into it. I loved customizing the CRM and doing all this stuff. But for me, the reason why I loved it is, at the end of the day, when you're building a business, you get to see the results of the activities of various parts of the organization come together in the CRM. So I really love that part of it. And as I was thinking about the CRM, I would start by thinking about, well, what's the information I'm trying to collect here? Or what do I want to see at the end of the day in a dashboard? And then work backwards to set up the systems the way I'd want to have it set up. I'll get into it a little bit in some of the examples I'll show, but you can also have a single pipeline if you wanted to. So rather than leads and then accounts, contacts, and deals, you could just say, you know what, we're not even going to use a separate object for leads, and we're going to have one process that's going to start out in marketing and then and the handoffs all going to be part of the same process, and they won't be separated as different objects. There are some reasons and arguments to do it other ways that might simplify it, but it also is going to create a lot of clutter because hopefully there's lots of leads that are coming in from marketing. There may even be a lot of junk in there, and it might create a lot of clutter for your sales team. But there are ways to structure that so that you can do it all in one process.
Awesome. Thank you. Hopefully that answered some of that question. Great. I'll let you keep getting into the rest of the content then.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, so now let's talk about that sales pipeline. So once the lead has been qualified and converted into an account, contact, and deal, so you're taking one record, the lead, and now you're making an account, a contact, and a deal, right? The account's going to be company name, the contact's obviously the individual, and then the deal is going to be the sales opportunity that you're working on. And at this point, the sales process is going to be really primarily tracked through the deal and organized by what we call stages, right, in the pipeline. And they're going to typically range from, at the very beginning stages of prospecting, to closed won. So let's take a look at that. So, stages, and why do you have stages in a pipeline? I think that there are three really good reasons to do that. So first, it gives you a snapshot of how many potential sales you have and how far along those potential sales are in your pipeline and how close they are to closing. So it just basically just helps you visualize, okay, how am I doing with my customers right now? The next is process coordination. So a really great reason why these stages are going to exist is because they're going to allow you to organize different tasks and assign responsibilities as deals progress through a pipeline. That's especially important in more complex sales that are going to require coordination across multiple team members. Imagine if you're doing a big estimation process in order to put together a proposal, that's going to be pretty important. If you have a financing portion to your sale, the financing agreement is going to have to get put in place. So coordinating that with a separate team is important. And the other thing that helps with this, with having different stages, is it also allows you to set up some automations. So your sales rep can just move a deal to a next stage, and then that could trigger a set of automations if you start to get more complex with the way that you're managing your sales CRM. And then the last thing, and I'll harp on this quite a bit, but sales forecasting. You wonder, as a startup, I think I always, when you're talking to VCs and they're trying to ask you how much money you're going to make in the next, or where you think your business is going to grow, it's always just you're putting a finger up in the air and making a complete guess, especially at the early days. And then you wonder why, especially when you talk to investors that are used to working with more mature companies, you wonder why these companies have so much visibility into their sales ahead of time. A lot of it's because they have done this. They've created pipeline stages, and their forecasting is based on the percentage likelihood of a deal closing at each stage. At first, this is just a best guess, but over time, as you analyze your sales data, you should be able to more accurately set a percentage likelihood of a deal closing at each stage. So on aggregate, across a large sales organization, this really does set you up well to accurately forecast your sales. If you're doing 10 or 20 sales right now, it's still going to be a bit of a guess, and you're going to be constantly tweaking this. But as you think about it, you can get to a place where you've got 1,000 customers, 10,000 customers. You've got enough volume that based on historical data. If a deal gets to a point where you're making a proposal, 40% of them are going to close. If a deal gets to a point where you're in the financing stages, in that example, you've got a 90% chance of closing. So you can start to assign those probabilities, and then when you go back and you look, you can do a weighted value of your entire pipeline and really know what's the current value of your pipeline, and do some great forecasting. In terms of deal stages, now they're pretty unique to your business, and I wish I could prescribe stuff to you. Every company is going to have a different set of requirements, and this is going to be a process you're going to go through with your sales team, or if it's just you for now. My best advice is go talk to sales leaders in similar industries and ask them about how they're structuring deal stages for their company. CRMs do help with some default stages, and those vary from simple to complex. And this chart here is going to show some different ways a sales process can be structured through deal stages. In this case, you have prospecting, which might be lists that are created by sales. Like you might put a customer into prospecting if it's maybe it's a follow-up deal, or if it's a customer that the sales rep knows through their own personal networking, and it's already kind of it's not part of the marketing qualification process. Qualification is going to be, of course, the sales team has to qualify. So marketing will send over a qualified lead, but sales is going to have that initial qualification as well. A good example would be in a door-to-door business. Qualification might be that the customer on the marketing side might just be that the customer is interested in having an appointment. Sales qualification might look at like the customer's background and ask if they're, if they, for example, in the pool cleaning business, do they own a pool? Not just do they own the pool, which hopefully marketing has figured out, but do they, do they have the need to or the money to pay for a cleaning business? That's probably the best example I can think of right now. The next stage is going to be the quote stage. So once you've qualified them, then you want to start building out a quote or a proposal. Sometimes this is called. But this is where you're getting the information and putting together that information. Once you've presented that to the customer, then you might move into a contracting phase, and that's basically where you've gotten a verbal offer or verbal yes from the customer, or you're in the midst of negotiating, but it's clear they're moving forward. And then finally, closed won is what we would call a deal that's been completed, and at that point you might kick off other processes. Maybe it's a post-sales process that you can manage through various stages. And then of course, if it's lost, it means that they were qualified but chose not to purchase the product or service. Again, in the case of the pool service business, this would be a homeowner with a pool that is eligible for the service but chose another option or decided to clean the pool themselves. Whereas unqualified might be you come to the end of that process and realize that the customer's pool broke and they're no longer qualified. So that's the difference between a lost customer and an unqualified customer in the sales process. And it's really important to make that distinction because you're measuring the efficacy of your sales rep. And if your sales rep is getting a bunch of unqualified customers, that's not going to be an accurate representation of their ability to sell your product. So I want to just go through some examples here. So in this case, we've got a customer. This is kind of a business that I did that was business to consumer. So in this process, it was a consumer product, actually a solar home energy efficiency type product, and it required financing. So initially, you had the prospecting stage. Once you've engaged with the customer, you've set the appointment. Then there's a verification process that happens to ensure that the customer is qualified for the financing or has the right type of home for the project. Then you confirm the appointment to make sure that they're going to be there, because sometimes they don't show, and you know, it's an important step in the process in a business like this. And then after you've met with them, you might set the proposal, and this could be an in-person meeting or virtual. Contract is then signed. In this case, you need financing, so that you're going to add an additional step for financing approval. And then after that's been approved, then you mark it closed won. So this is an example we used in a B2C business. Again, you know, as I mentioned, there's no prescriptive one way to do this. You've got to talk through your business and think about how you want to structure your process. And a lot of it has to do with, you know, kind of the needs of your business. Here's one of a SaaS company that I've worked at. So in the SaaS example, there are a few stages that actually focus a lot on discovery and solution development. So a bit more complex sale at the very beginning in particular, and then you get to the contracting. So here you have qualifying, then there's a discovery phase where it's just really trying to understand the customer's needs. Then you're going to start to build out a solution and review that. And then you're going to validate that solution is the solution that's been that will work for the customer. And then at that point, you basically just said, here's our proposal. And if they're moving forward from there, that means you've gotten a verbal, they're in contracting. Once the contract's signed, you move it to that phase. And then after that, you know, a larger org, you might do a finance audit to ensure that, you know, that everything kind of works out from the numbers perspective. And then closed won is the last stage. Here's one that I thought was interesting. Came across this in doing some research, but a buyer-centric example. So you can customize your pipelines in a different way. This is a slightly different approach, which is less about the stages or the actions that a sales rep are going to take, and more on the state of mind of your customer, what your customer is thinking throughout the process. So in this case, rather than, you know, prospecting, you're going to call it interest has been established. Next is the sales has qualified the lead. There's a gap that's been acknowledged. The need has been agreed upon with the customer. The offer is understood by the customer rather than presented. The preference by the customer has been formed. The decision by the customer has been made. And then you're implementing the revenue, you know, the product or the sale at that point. So I thought that was a pretty neat way to think about it, and just another example of how you really can customize this in a lot of ways for your business. This is a more complex sale of a B2B example. So you might have a qualification, identifying decision maker, scheduling demos. Maybe there's a free trial period that happens in the middle of that, and then you get to the proposal and purchase approval. So this is more common probably in a SaaS business. And then you might have an implementation afterwards. So you may tag on a few additional steps after closed won. So that's not uncommon at all. So post-sale, actually going back to my B2C example, we actually post-closed won, I should mention, we also had in project management stages after. So, doing a site visit, completing the install, wrapping up the project, those can be stages after you've gotten a closed won. And here you have a post-sale and onboarding check-in. If it's a goal to do a customer story for every single one, trying to grow the account within that prospect or within that customer with other parties at the company, and then maybe getting referrals. So these are all different things you can tack on to the end of a sale. This is an example that's used when estimating. A lot of gathering information, determining whether or not it makes sense to build a proposal. So that's going to be an important stage here. And then going out, getting the information to create the estimate, and then generating the proposal, sending that, negotiating, and then hopefully winning the deal. And then this is one I mentioned earlier. Is like you don't have to. It's not required that you have a separate lead object. You could just ignore the lead object and then work straight from accounts, contacts, and opportunities or deals. And in this case, you might use sales pipeline stages that include the marketing process. So a new lead, working lead, a marketing qualified lead, and then it would kick over to sales. Sales would acknowledge or accept it. Sales would qualify it in their own right, move it to closed won, and then maybe you have some post-sale activity. So this would be keeping everything into one pipeline. So there's a lot of different ways you can do this. And again, it's important to talk to people that have been in your shoes when you're thinking about that. So I want to kind of wrap up just with a few pro tips, and then open it up to Q&A in a few minutes here. In terms of getting set up, a couple things to keep in mind. I think that, if the number one purpose of a CRM is effectively communicating with your customers, the number two purpose is going to be to track the progress of your sales effort. So it's important to design your CRM with a vision for what reporting you'd like to see from that process. As I mentioned, I like to think about, well, what's in an ideal world, what's the best dashboard that's out there for me? And how do I work backwards to implement the dashboard that shows me that data? So if I want to know the time it takes from the point at which we have our first meeting with a customer to the point at which they sign a contract, well, then I need to know what date the meeting happened, and I need to know what date the contract was signed. And then I need to create a formula field that's going to determine the time in between, and that's going to show up in my report. That might not already be in there, right? And so the CRM might not come out of the box with that, because every business is going to have different needs. And and that velocity metric I just mentioned, you might use that in different circumstances, or it might be velocity from the time that a lead gets created to the time you have your first call, or on the back end, the time from when the contract is signed to when your onboarding team starts reaching out and working with them. These are important metrics to understand in your business. And as you think about, what's your ideal dashboard, that's where you want to start, and then work backwards and figure out how to implement a CRM that works for you. As you add fields for reporting, be careful not to overload your sales teams with button clicks. So I've done this a few times where, in my mind, it makes total sense to click all these buttons and have all this information. And from a sales manager perspective, or as an entrepreneur, you want to see all this data. But salespeople, I think it's really important to make it as easy as possible for them to operate within the systems you're building. They are not experts on CRM structure, implementations, or data. Your best salespeople, probably won't be your best at updating the CRM. But you want to continue to make sure that you're finding that balance between collecting the right information without slowing down the team, and automate as much of it as possible to minimize those clicks. So in this case, in this example, it's always going to help if you're also participating in the sales process and clicking the buttons yourself, so you can empathize with the experience of your team as you continue to grow your business. Next tip is just be thoughtful about how you organize your lead sources. You may only have 1 or 2 lead sources today, but that number is going to grow over time. So if you see a report that breaks down your results by lead sources in 2 years, how would that look? So ask yourself that question. You don't want to be in the habit of changing lead source data retroactively. That gets really hard because a lot of CRMs will mark a lead from a certain source, and you're not able to change that after the fact because they want to maintain the integrity of the data in the system, and they don't want you to accidentally have to rewrite all that. So that could be an issue when you're doing that. So think about lead sources. For example, if one of your sources is Google, one is Facebook, you might actually call it leads from advertising activities, and then you might have a subsource that's where that lead actually came from within that source. You might have another one for referrals, and then who actually referred it might be a subcategory to that source. But no matter what, it's just important to kind of think about that and go through that process of thinking about where your leads are going to come from in the future, and set that up early. Another pro tip, really important, your deal stages are not locked in stone. So get in there, set them up, and then as you go through the process, figure out what makes sense. Oftentimes I find myself renaming deal stages so they make more sense to our team. Or in some cases, you may even delete a deal stage because you know what, it doesn't make sense to have it as a separate stage, or you're adding deal stages when you're realizing that there are certain things that you need to make sure that happen during a sales process that aren't happening, where you're doing a handoff to somebody else. So that's something to think about. They'll change from time to time, and keep updating that. And then, as I mentioned on forecasting, you might not know it when you start, but over time, you are going to be able to calculate probabilities of closing a sale at each stage. And so for this reason, I always recommend going back in and revisiting and updating the probabilities associated at each stage. So if your first stage has a probability of closing of 5%, the next one's 10%, and then 20, and then 40, and then 75. As you get to scale, you can look back and say, okay, well, what were the actuals? Like, when a deal got to my third stage, was it actually 40% chance of closing, or was it actually closer to 25 or 60? And once you start to see that data, you can then go and update your forecasts, the probabilities at each stage, and then that will flow right into your reporting. And as you build out your sales pipeline, you're going to have a really great ability to see into the future. So keep that in mind as you're building this out. And then just the last thing I want to finish up with is some tips on picking a CRM. So as you can see from this slide, there is a lot out there. There's so many different tools that connect with each other in so many different ways. I'll say that one of my just a personal story is that one mistake I've made in my career, I think, as a founder, has been to try and build everything in one system. So we had for my first company, we had our entire sales process in the system. We have all of our customer support in the same CRM. We had all of our accounting and finance in the CRM, all that data connected. We had all of every transaction that we had in our marketplace was recorded in the CRM. And it was, in theory, really great because you could go and look at a customer and see everything associated with them. In practice, ran into a lot of issues. And one of the big lessons I learned is use a CRM for the purpose that it was built for. Don't try and take a CRM that's built as a square and try and fit it into a round hole. It's just not going to work for you. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about the CRMs and the needs of your business. If you need, for example, I say this about Zendesk, if you need a great customer support solution, go best in breed. Go and get that best customer support solution if that's going to be a big part of your business. If you're looking for a marketing automation software, you're not going to pick Zendesk and use it for that because we don't offer that. But go out and try and find the best marketing automation software that you can find and use it for marketing automation and not other things. So finding the best tools. And to tie up with that, what I've found over the years is that no one's been able to build that all-in-one platform. But what has happened over the last decade or so is that the systems have gotten much better at talking to each other. So it's really easy for them to connect data across systems, and a lot of these tools work very seamlessly together. In terms of what you're thinking when you're evaluating, a CRM in particular and a sales automation tool, I think what's really important that often gets overlooked because you're thinking about data and the things you're going to report and the customizations and all that. At the end of the day, you need to be able to communicate with your prospects. It's the single most important function of a CRM, but yet, many CRMs don't do this very well. And that's just because as different communication channels have opened up, these live in separate objects in a CRM, and seeing it in a unified place is really important. So, when you're working with a chat function and an email function and a phone function, think as you're looking at it, are those separate modules, separate products in a way, or are they all combined in one unified experience? I think that's something that's been really important. Because at the end of the day, you want to be able to see a customer, go look at the information, and see all the data there. So what I've seen in CRMs is that email systems, was the original way to communicate with customers, and then they added in ways to do phone integrations. You got to ask, how well do those phone integrations work? How well does SMS, if you're doing text messaging? That was a huge issue I ran into doing implementations on is SMS. It's not easy because it's not done in a very seamless way. And that's because a lot of these communication technologies popped up after the CRMs were built, and many CRMs are built on top of the same open source software. So that's something to look out for, and being able to see those communications again in one place is going to be super important, especially as new forms of communication arise over the year. Including WhatsApp now is a very popular tool that's being used in addition to chats and other types of social media tools for as part of your sales and customer support solutions. So definitely keep that in mind. But those are the things that I think about when you're picking your CRMs. So I want to wrap up there and open up for some questions. If I can answer any, I'd love to stay on and do that.
Awesome. Thanks, Brad. So I think you probably touched on this as you're talking about which CRM to choose, but could you talk about evaluating CRMs at different stages of company growth and how to smooth the migration if and when it's appropriate, and just the fact that it can be difficult to download your data and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think about that a lot, because I think it was a fear I had with my second startup, and we were evaluating two CRMs. One was a very established, expensive one, and one was a much cheaper, knockoff of it. And as we were looking at that, my co-founder at the time was very much pro using the knockoff, and I was like, no, let's use the tried and true. I know it's expensive. Maybe we can negotiate them down. It's a lot more expensive than it used to be. We went back and forth on that one, and we finally made the decision when he said, hey, look, why don't we go with the knockoff? If I'm wrong, and if we're switching in a year or two, I'll show up to work every day wearing a T-shirt of the software that you're promoting, and if you're wrong and we're still using it, you have to show up with their company software on a logo on your T-shirt. So that's kind of how we solved that one. After a lot of deliberation, I couldn't say no to him at that point, but. We went with that, the cheaper version, and I would say that the core data is not hard to get out. right? It's the implementation that you've got to think about. And so if you start off with a very low on implementation, low on customization CRM, I wouldn't worry too much about extracting that data out at some point later on, right? So, I'll say Zendesk Self, for example, our sales CRM is very much ready to go out of the box. So you're not spending a lot of time customizing and doing automations and all that stuff. So there's a lot less, that you have to worry about. When you're ready to move on to something else, you just download all of your opportunities, all of your contacts, your accounts, and all of your leads, and they just show up in Excel spreadsheets. That's pretty common. Where you do run into some issues, and the issue we ran into was being the geek I am when it comes to sales CRMs, we had over like 120 automations built in our CRM, right? And so as it started to grow and we were in it, and I spent a lot of time. I mean, it's like a full-time job to have someone do this and manage it. And I did all that stuff, and there was a lot. And I know that at some point, if and when we outgrew that CRM, it was going to be a challenge to extract from it. Not the data. The data I can get. It's all the automations, the system processes, and having to rebuild that in another system. So it really comes down to how complex and how much time you spend in that. If you imagine like a 5,000 person organization right now that's using Salesforce, for example, for their CRM, for their sales, that's going to be a really complex implementation, and getting out of that is going to be very, very difficult. I'm not sure. I think you've gotten to that phase, then it starts to get really challenging. It becomes a very expensive project to undo. But as a startup, my advice, having done it the other way around, would be to start with something a bit more simple, straightforward. Get your sales team just up and running very quickly, and think about that cost of administering and having somebody be an expert on how to customize and do that. And you want to avoid, especially as a founder, having to hire like a CRM specialist to help you with your CRM implementation. Hopefully there's somebody on your team technical enough to be able to just handle a very basic CRM implementation.
Yeah, great. Nellie is wondering if you would recommend an outside sales team, and why or why not in the context of a B2B SaaS model.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I was trying to steer away from sales advice, sales strategy advice, and focus more on the strategic implementation stuff. But I'm happy to wade into this. I would not at the early stages. You need to have that in-house. If I were an investor and I were talking to a founder and the founder had outsourced their sales, that would be a big red flag. So yeah, I would say no, maybe later on, sure. The feedback I've gotten in my own experiences in these cases and usually it was more not for doing sales, but more prospecting work. In my experiences, it often isn't going to be as successful as you think it is. Those types of teams work really well in businesses that have found product market fit, right? And are scaling and are growing. Hopefully, if you're here listening to me, you're still figuring out product market fit, which means that I wouldn't outsource.
Got it. Great. Well, that just about does it with questions. We really appreciate you sharing all your expertise and your personal experience, all the challenges and success you've had. And for everybody watching, this is recorded and will be posted on our YouTube page if you want to go back in and dig into what Brad shared today. Thank you so much, Brad. We really appreciate it. And thanks to Zendesk. And we hope to see everybody soon.